Hello, Doko here. So about a year ago, I created some videos on my channel here about coded automation. So this is when coded automation had just come out. So UiPath have done some updates, and one of the important updates is they have an AI tool included in Studio, which is AutoPilot, which allows you to generate code. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to show you the RPA challenge. When I created this video, uh, I had to use some of my own little tools, and I used ChatGPT to generate the code here. So now that UiPath have updated their product, this creating this RPA challenge is going to be a lot simpler than what it was when coded automation first came out. So as a reminder, what the exercise is you come to this website, RPA challenge, you download an Excel file. This is just a manual Excel file, which you download. This is not part of the exercise. So this Excel file is called challenge.xlsx, and it contains 10 rows of data. And when you click the start button, a timer will begin. And then what you're supposed to do is the first iteration, you'll get the first row and you put the data in here using your RPA, you submit, and you go through this 10 times. And at the end of it, you'll get a response telling you what your score was and how long it took. So it says, congratulations, my score was 0 because I didn't enter any data. I got 0 out of 17. It took me 19, almost 20 seconds. So that's the exercise. So what I'll do now is I'll just manually download this Excel file. I will open Studio, and I've created a project RPA challenge, which is just your standard process. I'm using 24.10.5 community edition, which I think it just came out 2 days ago. So if I go back to my project, I've just created a new project RPA challenge. And what I want to do, by default, it will create a XAML file here. So I want to use coded workflow. So I'll add in a coded workflow here rather than using the XAML file. So I could obviously change the name of this. I'll just leave it for default at the moment. Okay, it's generated a boilerplate here. And what I want to do, the first thing I want to do is just copy that Excel file that I downloaded into my project directory. So I'll come over here in my project directory, and I've downloaded that Excel file, and I'll just paste it in here so it's local. Okay, so I've pasted in the challenge Excel file. So if you open that Excel file, we can see the contents. It just contains some headers here and 10 rows of data. So we're going to take the first row of data, input it in, second row of data up to 10, and get the result. Now, in order for coded automation to work with your UI, we need to use object repository so it knows what screens we're interacting with. So in this case, we're just basically interacting with the one screen, which is the RPA challenge screen. So if we reset, what we want to do is capture these elements so then we can start interacting with these elements. So obviously you're probably familiar with object repository. So this is not a tutorial on object repository, but it's pretty easy to capture this screen. Just come in here, start doing a recording, or you capture all elements. Okay, so it's detected the elements. We don't want this, so we can just click and it will deselect. I'll try to deselect this one, and I think that looks okay. And then we do a capture, and it will capture those elements. So it captures the start button, these input fields, submit button, and we'll say okay. Now if you have a look at this, we've got this cloud download, which was some selection here. We don't need this, so we can just delete this one. And the rest looks good, so we'll save that. So now we've got the RPA challenge, the object repository. We can now start telling the autopilot to read our Excel and start putting stuff into this particular screen. Now this, I'll just rename this instead of calling it Edge RPA challenge, because it's just a bit clunky having that in my code. I'll just call it RPA challenge. I'll just abbreviate it. So my code, it's just so my code looks neater. So I'll just change that name, and I'll just save everything. Okay, now that we have our object repository screen here, the RPA challenge, and we have our Excel file, which is here, challenge, we can then ask AutoPilot to generate some code. Obviously, we could write the code ourselves, but let's just ask AutoPilot. So we ask it to use an Excel workbook activity to read the challenge file and input into the screen RPA challenge. So it knows about this challenge file because it's in the project directory, and it knows there's a screen called RPA challenge because that's in our object repository. So if we run this, let's see what happens. So you can see that it's generated some code here, and it's using the workbook activity, which I asked it to use rather than the Excel. It's read the file and it's put it into a data table, and then it's opened the screen and it's looped through each one of these. So let's have a look at the code. So we'll confirm this. We could discard it and give it another command, but we will confirm, and then we'll have a look at the code. So this is good, reads into the data table. So if we have a look at the read range, the parameters here are sheet 1. So this is where the data is in sheet 1. If it was a different sheet, we could just change the sheet name. And it's put true for the headers because the file has headers. So if that didn't have headers, we could change this. So the read range, so read everything in sheet 1, open the page, and then start looping through. But I didn't tell it to click the start button. So you can see here, it's clicking a submit button. So before we start clicking, we could have told it to click the start button. So we'll click the start button here. And this is the button here, dot start. You can see everything's nice and neat here. So you can see here it's created these objects to allow us to reference the descriptors here. So it's got descriptors, edge, which is the application, and then I've called the screen RPA chal. So you can see here it's got some issue here. It doesn't know what's row first name. Now the reason is because it's just read in each row as a var. So if we change that to a data row, then it will recognize those rows. So if we change that to data row, so sometimes you'll have to modify some of the code. So if we change that to each row is a data row, then you can see that this has been fixed. Now, if we run this, what it's going to input into these fields, it's going to click the button and input according to the default. It will use hardware events. So there's some type into activities, type into options, and type into options by default. It will use hardware events and using the 0.3 second delay. So if we want to speed this up, we need to create a variable of type into options and set the typing so that it's to simulate and reduce those delays. So the problem here we have is that in this type into, if we go to the definition, if we right click and we go to show documentation, you can see the options here under the show documentation for type into. So type into has these overloads. It has an anchor and a string. Has these two, has two strings, and has a string and a type into options. So what we want, preferably we would want a string, which is what we're typing into, or an anchor, and then we would want a second one which tells us the text, and then the type into options. But since there's nothing with 3 parameters that allows us to do what we want to do, we can set the text in type into options. So we just, if we write a little function and pass it the text, and inside type into options, we set type into options.text equals the text we want to set, and then we set to simulate, we delay 0, then we can pass in a type into options rather than a text in our field here. See, we've just passed in the raw text here. So what we want to pass in is a parameter called we want to pass in a text, and we want to return back a type into options, which contains this text being set in the type into options. So if we want this, what we want to do is create a function. So we could ask AutoPilot to create it for us, or we could just create one. So let's say we weren't that strong in C#, so we might ask AutoPilot. So we want to create a function with a string as a parameter. That'll be this string, this text over here, and it sets all the type into options and returns a type into option variable. So let's see if AutoPilot, what AutoPilot will generate for that. Okay, so we can see that it's created a type into options, And okay, so this is not exactly what we want, but we'll just confirm it and have a look at the code is generated. So it's created a type into options. So what it's done here is generated some code here and below. It's also generated some code below. So what we just need is this below code. This is redundant. We don't need this create type into options. It's done it twice. So we'll delete that. That was inside the execute. So we have a separate function which is called create type into options, and we pass a text string, and this text string gets set as a text. And then what we want to do is we could keep all of this stuff, but let's say we want to just simplify it a bit. We'll get rid of the verify options. We could leave that if we want, but we're just for this exercise. We want the mode to be a simulate. So we want dot simulate. Empty fields. So we'll just check what the correct options are here. Empty fields, we'll set that as multi-line. Again, we could just delete this, leave it as it is. Delay between, so it's already set these as 0. And delay between keys, we could put that also as 0. And that's our type into options. Now, instead of this, we want to make our code short. So we'll just put, we'll just call it type ops, so that our code is. So all we're going to do is pass in the string, and it will be set here, and with these values with the simulate, and also with the delays between. Now you can set the interaction mode when we do the open here, up here, but we can't set the delays between, etc. So even if we set the simulate here in the open, we're not going to get these delay before and delay after unless we set it into the type into options. So we do a similar thing. We could do a similar thing with the click options. There's one called click options. But for now, what we want to do, we've got this type into options. We want to replace this, the row here, we want to just add a type into options and pass in that string for each of these. Now we could do a substitute here, but there's no substitute. There's no replace in the UiPath coding at the moment. So we'll just manually do this replace here. So I'm just pasting these in to call the function and return a type into options rather than just passing in a text here. So now we're missing the closing brackets on these, closing parentheses. So we'll close out these parentheses. Again, it would be easier if we did a substitute. Anyway, so now that that's done, we can run this and we'll see what happens. Now the type into should be fast because they're using this type into options. The click will be a little bit slow because we didn't change the default click, so it'll be using the hardware events. But we could just do the same thing for a click, put the click options here and use the click options instead of just what the default click options are. So let's run this and see how it works. Let's just check. Okay, we haven't got anything running. So if we run this, it should run using simulate. So it's opening up the challenge. Okay, so we have this error last name. So this is a part of the exercise actually because the column name is last name space. So we need to fix that. So before this runs, we'll stop that and we'll change this here. The column name is actually last name space, so we need to put a space in there. So that's in the file, in the challenge file, that's the actual name of the column. So we could go and fix the Excel file, or we could just put the space in here. So if we run it again, it should work this time. Okay, so you can see it's quite fast. The click is a little bit slow, but it doesn't affect it that much. We could speed up the click by putting a simulate with the click as well. So it'll go through the 10 and then we'll get the result. So this is how easy it is to use coded automation to implement the RPA challenge. So congratulations, 24 seconds. I think if we put the click in there, we could probably get it down to, I think, around 10 seconds. So we could modify the click to use the type into options. But this is just an example of what you could do using coded automation for this. Now it's a lot easier. You can see UiPath, they've added in the generate code, which makes it a lot easier with the AutoPilot to generate, especially if you're not a developer. And they've also added in, you can see we can use this class here where it's got descriptors, this namespace here, and the class to reference the object repository. Previously, I had to create my own classes to get this type of structure in my code. So that's an example of how to use the latest version, which just came out a couple of days ago, which is the 24.10.5 with the AutoPilot and coded automations for RPA challenge.